All right. Good morning, everybody. Got some of you guys' attention. Awesome. All right. So we will continue in our Bible study through Genesis. It's nice where this, right now at least, we're kind of overlapping a little bit with the sermons and what we're talking about in Bible study. It won't be that way for much longer, because obviously for the sermons, if you're here for this morning, it was just focusing on Abraham. So we're going into detail with some of those instances where really in this one, we're going to get a good chunk through Abraham's life in this one. We still will have Abraham next couple of weeks. In a couple weeks, next week we will. But quickly we'll transition away from Abraham and look at Isaac and then Jacob. And so that'll happen in the next few weeks where the sermons will focus a little bit more on Abraham for a bit longer. But today we're continuing with the story of Abraham, and we're going to be looking at chapters 15 to 20. So I encourage you, get a Bible if you do not have one. Here we have the hard copies of the Bible in the back, or you can pull it up on your phone or share off of somebody. We're going to be kind of in and out of certain sections and then kind of walking through it. And basically, with the time we have, we'll get through what we get through, because there's a lot of ground to cover in chapters 15 to 20. We will get through what we get through and leave room for, as we go through it, discussions, but really we'll try and get through kind of the main plot points of the story and reflect upon what they mean for us. And so again, last time we focused really on, the call of Abraham, which if you were here for the sermon, we talked about that today. And then we looked at kind of the first couple instances in Abraham's life, namely, him going down to Egypt, and we noted that God never told him to do that, and there were some disastrous effects that happened there, but God was still faithful to his promises. God made the promise to Abraham that, hey, you will be blessed, and when he leaves Egypt, you could say that he was more blessed leaving it than he was going in terms of earthly possessions, in terms of influence. That was still raised for him, and that was still going to be used for him. And now we pick up the story after his nephew has separated, and so Abraham is truly on his own at this point. It's just him, Sarai, and they're kind of militia, or like the people who were serving him. That's who's living with him now. And we turn the page to chapter 15, which this is probably, for me at least, one of my favorite chapters in the Old Testament for sure. But I would say also it's up there in the Bible, Genesis chapter 15. And it's one of those stories that is one that maybe you didn't hear in Sunday school. I can pretty much guarantee you didn't hear it in Sunday school, at least not when you were younger. But it's one of the most important chapters, really, in the story of Abraham's life, is what happens in chapter 15. And so we're going to go ahead and we're going to read, part of it and kind of slow down in this section in particular. So I'll invite you to turn your Bibles, chapter 15, and we'll see what happens. So Genesis chapter 15, starting in verse 1, says this: After these things, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Remember, his name isn't Abraham yet. It's still Abram, exalted father. The Lord came to Abram in a vision, said, "Fear not, Abram, I am your shield, and your reward shall be very great." But Abram said, "O Lord God, what will you give me? For I continue childless, and the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus." Basically, it's just someone in his, kind of group that is kind of a servant of his. He's like, hey, this is like the one who my stuff would go to if I were to die right now, and it's not in my blood. And then Abram said, "Behold, you have given me no offspring, and a member of my household will be my heir." And behold, the word of the Lord came to him: "This man shall not be your heir. Your very own son shall be your heir." And he brought him outside and said, "Look toward heaven and number the stars, if you are able to number them." Which, how many of you have ever tried that? Maybe when you were a kid, to try and count how many stars can you get to. It's pretty amazing, right? To think wow, there's a lot. Try and number them. Then God said to him, "So shall your offspring be." And Abraham believed the Lord, and God counted it to him as righteousness. And then God said to him, I am the Lord who brought you out from Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to possess. But Abraham said, O Lord God, how am I to know that I shall possess it? And God said to him, bring me a heifer 3 years old, a female goat 3 years old, a ram 3 years old, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. And Abraham brought all these things, cut them in half, and laid each half over against the other. But he did not cut the birds in half, and when the birds of prey came down on the carcasses, Abram drove them away. Like I said, this isn't normally, at least this part of the story, isn't what you pretty much learn in Sunday school, is it? Because everything seems to be going great. Abraham comes to God and says, God, remember that promise you made me about how you're going to give me a bunch of offspring? He's like, listen, clock's ticking. That's really what he's doing. He's saying, God, when is this going to happen? And he's proposing a new idea to God. God, what if things pass to someone in my household? Because that's what it is at this point. And what's God's answer? Will it go through that member of his household? No. He's like, no. And God reminds him of the promise, and he gets to say even more. And he tells him, listen, you're going to have so many offspring, you're not going to be able to count them. And it's through you and Sarah, or you and Sarai. God is very clear. He's doubling down on the promise he made. It is not through you and somebody else. It is not through any other means other than you and your wife. And that family lineage is where the promises will come through. And then Abraham is like, so when is this going to happen? He's basically saying, God, how can I have assurance? And then God tells him to cut animals in half. How many of you were like, yep, that's what I expected God to tell Abraham to do? Cut a bunch of animals in half. What is going on? Anybody have any ideas or guesses? You can't answer because I know you know. I know you know. So hold on. Anybody other than John? Anybody have any clue or guesses? You all are like, I want to hear what John has to say. Go ahead, John. What's going on? You're right like 99% of the time, John. Yep. 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 No, you're exactly right. You're exactly right. So, for those who didn't hear, John was mentioning it's a covenant, much deeper than just a contract. But this was a covenant, and it was very common in ancient Near Eastern culture, which is what Abraham came from. So he was very familiar. So again, notice this: God told him to get the animals, and he doesn't even need to tell Abraham what to do with them. Abraham already knows. Very clear as you read through the story, as you read closely at the text. Abraham knows, you're telling me to get these animals. I know what we're doing, God. You're cutting these animals in half, and you're meant to kind of imagine it, as like gross as it may be to us. You're meant to visualize it of what happens when you cut animals in half. What is going to come out of them? Yeah, guts and blood. And you're supposed to take them and put them like on the ground and separate them from each other. And what's going to be all in the middle of these two pieces of the animal? What's going to be in the middle? Just a whole bunch of, the mess, a whole bunch of blood. And Abraham knows, this is a covenant we're making, God. You're making this covenant with me, that you are going to fulfill your end of the bargain and I'll fulfill my end of the bargain. And what two parties would do is they would make their agreements, and then they would each walk through the blood to sign and show, if I don't fulfill my end of the bargain, let this happen to me. It's a big deal. Big moment right now. And Abraham is like, great, I'm going to get some assurance from God. I'm going to get to give my assurance back to him. And we're going to get to have this covenant together. But let's keep reading, because this is where it gets so beautiful. Verse 12. Verse 12 says, as the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell on Abram. That phrase, deep sleep, it's the same Hebrew when Adam and Eve was formed out of his ribs. Beautiful. Same Hebrew. The deep sleep that Adam was in and that Eve came out of, same deep sleep that Abram is now in. He's in a deep sleep, and behold, dreadful and great darkness fell upon him. There's this like nightmare almost that is upon him. And then the Lord said to Abram, know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs, and will be servants there, and they will be afflicted for 400 years, but I will bring judgment on the nation that they serve, and afterward they shall come out with great possessions. Real quick note, who is God talking about there? Yeah, he's talking about Moses leading the people out of the Exodus. Already here. Now Moses, the traditional interpretation and what we believe is Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Bible. So Moses is making sure that the people knew, like, hey, even from this very beginning, God was making promises to Abraham, and he knew what was going to happen to his people. So Moses is making sure that the people of Israel, as they hear this story again, that they make this connection. And then verse 15, and as for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace. You shall be buried in a good old age. So Abram, you're going to live for a long time. And then it says, and they shall come back here in the 4th generation, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. And then when the sun had gone down and it was dark, behold, a smoking fire pot and a flaming torch passed through these pieces. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abraham, saying, to your offspring I give this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates, to the land of the Kenites and Kezanites, the Kadamites, the Hittites, Perizzites, Rephaim, Amorites, Canaanites, Girgashites, Jebusites. Basically naming all the surrounding areas. He's naming all the territories that it's on. I want you, as you're reading this, who never walked through the blood? Abram never did. God went through it for him. This is one of the most beautiful and honestly one of the clearest moments of the gospel of Jesus Christ in the Old Testament. What has Jesus done? He has fulfilled his end of the bargain that God made to Abraham. You're going to be a blessing. The whole world will be blessed. God held up his end of the deal. Did Abraham ever held up his end of the deal? Of being faithful to God? Of following God completely? Did he be faithful to God completely? No. We've already seen him do it. And guess what? Chapter 16, he's going to do it again. And his people disobeyed God. That's the story of the Old Testament. And yet what does Jesus do on the cross? Is he gets treated the way Abram should have. The way God's people should have. The way we should have. For not holding up our end of the covenant. And Jesus said, I will take your place. And so even in Genesis 15, this beautiful image of God taking the place of his people. Of God being the faithful one. Of even when we are faithless, he is faithful. Total pointing forward to what Jesus would do. All from the bloody guts of animals. Right? Like you read this and you're like, what is going on here? But it's one of the most beautiful chapters, in my opinion, in the whole Bible. It's amazing. But it continues. That's chapter 15. God essentially doubling down his promise to Abraham. Making his covenant. Yeah, Bob, you got something? Yep. Oh, wait till chapter 16, and we're going to get to the root of the issue fundamentally in Genesis 16. Yeah, we'll get to it. And we'll get to the root of it. Like this really is the origin of the conflict with Israel and the surrounding areas, and really the Muslim people. Genesis 16 is kind of the root of it. And so we'll keep reading. So God doubles down on the promise to Abraham, reminds him of the covenant, and even says, listen, I'm going to take your place. Even when you're not faithful, Abraham, I will be. So even when Abraham messes up, he cannot eliminate the promises of God. It's that rock solid. So, chapter 16, beginning in verse 1. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, here's another thing to remember. Hebrew doesn't when the Hebrew writers use words, they do so on purpose. We know who Sarai is. Like as you're reading the story, we already have met her. We already know her. But it goes out of its way to remind you, whose wife is Sarai? Abram's. It's doing that on purpose. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne no children. Again, reminding you, God made this incredible promise, and it's pretty late in the game, and they still got no children. But she had a female Egyptian servant, whose name was Hagar. And Sarai said to Abram, behold, now the Lord has prevented me from bearing children, which is factually correct. She is totally right on the money. Here's where it goes off the rails. Go into my servant, it may be that I shall obtain children by her. In other words, sleep with Hagar. Guys, this is those instances where I'm like, don't listen to your wife. But what does Abram do? Does he then say, we really shouldn't be doing this? This isn't faithful. This isn't according to God's will. Does Abraham say that? Nope. It just took like a nanosecond probably. And Abraham listened to the voice of his wife and took Hagar, the Egyptian, her servant, gave her to Abram, her husband, as wife. They slept together. And he went into Hagar, and she conceived. And when she saw that she had conceived, she looked with contempt on her mistress. And Sarai said to Abram, may the wrong done to me be on you. Talking to Abraham. I gave my servant to your embrace, and when she saw that she had conceived, she looked on me with contempt. May the Lord judge between you and me. But Abraham said to Sarai, behold, your servant is in your power. Do as you please. And then Sarai dealt harshly with her, and Hagar fled from her. There's a whole lot in this, which we're not going to have time to get to, because we got a lot of ground to cover still. But I want you to notice this. Moses, as he's writing this, but the story really wants us to know that, listen, Abraham and Sarah, what are they doing? They're taking things in their own hands. That's what they're doing. God's way isn't working, or so we think. We're going to take it into our own hands. And you already see the effects are disastrous. Where they were peaceful and where they were getting along relationally, now what is entered in? Jealousy and strife and anger and hatred and abuse. All stemming from Abraham and Sarah, because they were in it together. Abraham tries to push it off on her and be like, no, this is your doing. And she tries to push it off on him like, this is your problem to deal with, Abraham. It's all back to Genesis 3. Remember, Adam and Eve? There's blame game. Everybody else's fault but me. And it's doing the same thing again. And now there's discord and strife and misery and abuse. And Hagar is like, I got to get out of here. And she runs away. And you keep reading, verse 7 then. Then the angel of the Lord found her, Hagar, found her by a spring of water in the wilderness, the spring on the way to Shur. And he said to her, Hagar, servant of Sarai, where have you come from? And where are you going? And Hagar said, I'm fleeing from my mistress Sarai. The angel of the Lord said to her, return to your mistress and submit to her. And the angel of the Lord also said to her, I will surely multiply your offspring, so that they cannot be numbered for multitude. And the angel of the Lord said to her, behold, you are pregnant, and shall bear a son, and you shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has listened to your affliction. He will be a wild donkey of a man, his hand against everyone, and everyone's hand against him. and he shall dwell over against all his kinsmen, or be in conflict with all the people around him. And so she called the name of the Lord who spoke to her, You are a God of seeing. For she said, Truly here I have seen him who looks after me. Therefore the well was called Bir Lahai Roi. It lies between Kadesh and Bered. This really, I mentioned to Bob when you brought it up, this really is the origin of the conflict in the Middle East. Because what you have right here is you have the people of Abraham, Jews and Muslims, who both claim to be children of the promise to that land. The Muslims trace it back to Ishmael, and they say, this is the son of the promise, so we're rightfully due this land. But as you continue reading the story, for Jews, and by extension then Christians, we recognize that Ishmael is not the son of the promise, but who is? We haven't met him yet, but who is? Isaac. And that's where the Jewish people come from. And so both of these groups trace it back and say, our ancestors are the children of the promise, and this land is ours. And this is where it all began. And I want you to make sure you recognize this. Maybe overstating it, maybe not. How did it all begin? It began by two people who tried to take things in their own hands. God had something he told them, and they went a different way. And you see all the dysfunction that happened in their immediate family, but you see the ripple effects even to this day, right? Literally in our news right now are the ripple effects of their decision to say, our way, not your way, God. It's astounding to kind of see. And it really helps show you how, this is not an easy thing. You can't just say, why don't the people there just get along? You can see, man, there is a lot going on. And it's a complicated history in that land. All right, so that's what you see there, but a couple things to note about Hagar specifically, because I think it's beautiful. This is the only instance where God makes a promise to a woman that your descendants will be great. Beautiful. And it's this Gentile, non-Hebrew servant woman. She's got 50 strikes against her, and yet, what do we see God do to her? Provide for her, and care for her, and protect her. It's this incredible thing. She's also the only person to name God. I don't know if you knew that. Every other time, God gives them a name to call him. She doesn't. She calls him, you are a God of seeing. The Hebrew is very intricate. And actually, a better way to think about it is, you are the God who sees me. I am seen by you. That's kind of the idea that's going. And so Hagar is making this incredible declaration of faith of saying, wow, even though I'm on the run, even though I've been mistreated by my mistress or, by Sarai, God, you see me, and you protect me, and you care for me, and you will provide for me. And she needs to confess that, because what's the call that God puts on her life? What does he tell her to do? Go back. By all human standards, it's what is going on here? But God calls her to go back, but attaches his promise of, I will be with you. And he protects her. He takes care of her, even though from a human perspective, she thinks there's no way I should do this. If you already listened to the sermon this morning, you can already see these themes repeating over and over again in this story. Incredible moment of God's provision for even the people who are disregarded and the outcasts. And you see that in the story of Hagar. So even when God's people who should know better are messing things up, God is still providing and taking care of people. Makes sense? Yeah, Jane. Uh, I don't think that it's a different word. Yeah, it's a different word. Yep. All right. So now that's Hagar, and you're still going to see kind of the Hagar, Ishmael part of the story a little bit. It's going to be in the background a little bit. But as you continue, we get to chapter 17, which we're not going to read all of chapter 17, but basically then chapter 17 is when the covenant of circumcision comes into play. And God tells Abraham, again, by this point, Abraham, as you see in verse 1, is how old? Verse 1 of chapter 17, how old is he? 99. So if you're dating this, 13 years have passed from God making that covenant. That's a long time, even from that covenant. But if you remember, how old was Abraham when he first got the call from God and left his land? He was 75. So 24 years, if I'm good at math, 24 years have passed, and still nothing in terms of a son from Abraham and Sarah. So they look at it, and they're like, God's still not doing anything, but he's still making his promises, and he makes the covenant of circumcision as the sign to set the Jewish people apart of all the boys being born. And then we get to verse 15. So chapter 17, verse 15. And God said to Abraham, by the way, he renames him there. He renames him there in those 13 years from Abram to Abraham, which is not exalted father, but father of many, which is salt in the wound, because Abraham would go around introducing himself to people, and they'd be like, what's your name? Father of many. Oh. How many sons do you have? I got none. Ah. Okay then. Some father of many, right? And so there's already this element of faith that he has to have, even in being this renamed from God. And so, verse 15, God said to Abraham, as for Sarai, your wife, you shall not call her Sarai, but Sarah shall be her name, and I will bless her. And moreover, I will give you a son by her. I will bless her, and she shall become nations. Kings of people shall come from her. Then Abram fell on his face, and what did he do? He laughed and said to himself, shall a child be born to a man who is 100 years old? Shall Sarah, who is 99 years old, bear a child? And Abraham said to God, oh, that Ishmael might live before you. In other words, he's like, listen, I already got a son. And God said, no, but Sarah, your wife, shall bear you a son. And you shall call his name Isaac. I will establish my covenant with him as an everlasting covenant for his offspring after him. So here you get some name changes, and they're significant. Sarai becomes Sarah, which is translated pretty much as princess. That's why there's this reference of, listen, kings and these nations are going to come from her, that she is going to be royalty, because that's what her name is. She's going to be this royal princess in the world. And as he gets the promise of you will have a son, Abraham laughs. And what is the name of the son that is promised to Abraham and Sarah? What's his name? Isaac. We will get there in a little bit, but what does the name Isaac mean? Anybody know? He laughs. And as you say it in Hebrew, kind of a way to say it, Yitzhak. But the way it's written in Hebrew, there's a pause in there, and you're meant to double pronunciate the ah. So that's why there's two A's in it. Isaac. As you say it, that is known as what in English? Onomatopoeia. Anybody remember onomatopoeia? Buzz. And when you say a word, it sounds like the word you're saying. Isaac is an onomatopoeia. Because you say it in Hebrew, Isaac. It kind of sounds like you're chuckling. It sounds like you're laughing. And God names him Isaac. And it says he laughs. Who's laughing? Maybe, but who's laughing? Isaac's name, he laughs. Who's the he? Okay, so you're in the story. It's like, well, Abraham's pretty clearly laughing. Why is Abraham laughing? He's like, this doesn't make sense. This is crazy. Yeah, you got to be kidding me. And even we do that, right? You're like, somebody says something, or like, you're thinking about something. You're like, you got to be kidding me. You just laugh because you're like, this is the only thing I can do. It's something so crazy, something that has like no possibility of happening. You laugh. But here's what I want you to realize. And as you read through the story, and we'll get to it next time, Sarah will laugh as well. But I want you to think too, when it says Isaac laughs, yes, Abraham, and Sarah, they do laugh. I want you to realize this too. God laughs. I don't know if you knew that, but God laughs. Read through the Bible, and there's definitely a number of instances where it talks about God laughing. Sometimes he laughs, like in Psalm 2, for instance. He laughs at the rulers of the world who think that they are in charge and they are at God's level. And it says, what does God do? God sits in the heavens and laughs. He's like, you guys don't even know what you're doing. But also God laughs, like in this instance, when we think something is too impossible for him. And he laughs. He's like, do you think that's too hard for me? Like, that's what he's doing. God is like, do you think that your wife's infertility and that your age, do you think that's something I can't fix? Like, that's what he's like, he's laughing at what we think is impossible. And so even in the name of the Son, it's an opportunity for Abraham and Sarah to trust in God. That they're given this name before the Son even comes. Of God laughs at things we think are impossible. But when God promises something, what will he do? He'll come through. He will fulfill his promises. Now, I want to make sure you're hearing me correctly. That doesn't mean that whatever we really, really ask of God, he will give us. Sometimes we confuse what we want, even if it's a good thing, and what God has actually promised us. And this is where some Christian denominations get kind of off track, is we think that God has made promises that, frankly, he hasn't made. Like, has God promised you that you are going to be wealthy beyond wealthy? Has he made that promise to you? Yeah, obviously not. No, he hasn't. He hasn't made that promise to you. Has God promised you that your life will be easy? Has God promised you a life that will not have suffering? See, there are these things that sometimes we think, God has surely promised us these things, and then we put it on him, and then when he doesn't come through with what we think he promised us, we then say, God, you're not trustworthy, you're not faithful. But the thing is, we are starting off in the wrong spot where we haven't realized what are the actual things God has promised us. And for them, for Abraham and Sarah, what he actually promised to them was she will give birth. As crazy as it sounded, that was what he promised to them. And so in the face of their incredulousness, if that's a word, he laughs. And he's like, if you think this is hard for me, I'm just going to laugh. It's an incredible thing about the names in the scriptures. Now, as we continue, what time we got? All right, verse 30, all right. We're going to try and breeze through this next section, and there's a lot of stuff to try and cover. But after chapter 17 and this promise and this declaration of the name Isaac, we then see chapter 18, which focuses on very well-known stories about Abraham. And really what you get is two instances of Abraham, and then you do have the instance where Sarah laughs. And so the beginning of chapter 18, you see this picture of Abraham, that he is generous and hospitable. So he's like a host. So verse 1 in chapter 18 says, and the Lord appeared to him, Abraham, by the oaks of Mamre, as he sat at the door of his tent in the heat of the day. He lifted his eyes up and looked. And behold, there were three men standing in front of him, When he saw them, he ran from the tent door to meet them and bowed himself to the earth and said, O Lord, which it says Lord, but another way to think about it is he's addressing basically like, hey, he's recognizing, hey, I want to show you honor as a guest. So I know it has it capitalized, but at this moment, Abraham is not addressing who he thinks is God. Okay? Make sense? O Lord, in terms of, hey, I want to give you recognition because you're a guest. If I have found favor in your sight, do not pass by your servant. Don't go on to somewhere else. Let a little water be brought, and wash your feet, and rest yourselves under the tree, while I bring a morsel of bread, that you may refresh yourselves. And after that you may pass on, since you have come to your servant. And so they said, do as you have said. In other words, what Abraham is doing is he is being a gracious and hospitable host to these three travelers. He doesn't know who they are, but he is going above and beyond what hospitality looked like. We know, and there's something going on with this. These aren't just people. The writer of Hebrews puts it this way: Abraham entertained angels unaware. Maybe you've heard that phrase before. The writer of Hebrews makes the connection of like, Abraham just thinks these are three men traveling along the way, and what's my role? What's my job? Be hospitable and to be generous and to meet their needs and to go above and beyond. It's an extravagant meal. We may read past those details, but it gets very specific about like, hey, the amount of food this guy prepared is way more than they needed. He provided way more than what 4 adult men and Sarai would have needed for their meal. But he's being generous and hospitable before they go on their way. And you jump down to verse 9, you begin to see what's happening. And this is where Abraham starts to realize, like, oh, these are not just men with me now. They say, where is Sarah, your wife? And he said, she's in the tent. And the Lord said, again, Abraham doesn't know, but the Lord is now speaking. I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah, your wife, shall have a son. And I was like, okay, whoa. This guy knows a lot more than just any normal human would. And Sarah was listening at the tent door behind him. And now Abraham and Sarah were old, advanced in years. If you didn't already know that, again, it's repeating this theme over and over again. They're really old. They're really old. The way of women had ceased to be with Sarah. In other words, she can't, biologically speaking, have kids. And so Sarah laughed to herself. There you go. Sarah laughed to herself, saying, after I am worn out and my Lord is old, shall I have pleasure? In other words, the pleasure of children. Shall I have the pleasure of having a child of my own? And the Lord said to Abraham, why did Sarah laugh? She thinks she's on her own, no one noticing. And the Lord is like, why did Sarah laugh and say, shall I indeed bear a child now that I'm old? And here's beautiful verse. Is anything too hard for the Lord? Like, you can just sit with that and just be like, wow, is anything too hard for me? Is anything too hard for the Lord? And at the appointed time, I shall return to you about this time next year, and Sarah shall have a son. But Sarah denied it, didn't believe it, saying, I didn't laugh. I love this little aside. I didn't laugh, for she was afraid. And then the Lord said, no, but you did laugh. You're meant to laugh and be like, yeah, like she tries to play it off like, no, I didn't laugh. I didn't laugh. And the Lord is like, yeah, but you did. Yeah, but you did. Like just kind of a gentle nudge, a gentle rebuke, so to speak, of, no, but you really did. Maybe if you're a parent, you've done that with your kids before, where they say, no, I didn't do X, Y, or Z, or like I was doing this. It's like, okay, but really, because you can kind of call them on it. And that's what God is doing a little bit with Sarah. And so you've seen this picture of Abraham being this generous host. You get this interlude with Sarah laughing, but God in this mysterious visitors. But now we get to know what these visitors are up to. So the men turned from there and went towards Sodom. Dun, dun, dun. You guys remember from last week when Lot went to Sodom? It's coming back again. Went to Sodom, but Abraham still stood before the Lord. Then Abraham drew near and said, will you indeed sweep away the righteous with the wicked? Abraham has now put the pieces together. This is not just a man, this is the Lord. And so now Abraham is beginning to talk to the Lord. Will you indeed sweep away everybody in Sodom? And then are you going to sweep away the righteous with the wicked? because he knows that these messengers of God are coming to bring judgment upon this city because of the outcry that has reached the Lord's ears. And then Abraham says this, suppose there are 50 righteous within the city. Will you then sweep away the place and not spare it for the 50 righteous who are in it? And then Abraham kind of pleads with God and says, listen, God, you are merciful. You don't want to you don't want to wipe out the righteous with the wicked. And God says, okay, if there's 50. And if Abraham was playing like a game show, pressure luck, he might think about stopping here, but what does he do? What about 45? Can I get 45, God? 45? Okay. And then you're like, all right, Abraham, let's go ahead. Let's quit while you're ahead. But he keeps going and going, and he gets it down to 10. What I always wonder as I read through this is like, why did he stop at 10? What's that? He figured it was safe. And this is one of those things, this is Abraham being an advocate for the people of Sodom. He's being an advocate for the people of Sodom. But I want you to realize this, he's not the perfect advocate. But I want you to notice these two instances, this generosity and hospitality, this being an advocate, do they remind you of anybody that comes later on in the story of the scriptures? Remind you of anybody? Yeah, Jesus. These are figures of what Jesus would show us in full. Is Jesus generous and hospitable? You better believe it. He gives us more than we can imagine. He literally prepares a meal for us. He gives it to us in plentiful, and you see these echoes of what Jesus would do. But even more than that, who's a better advocate than Abraham is? Jesus is. Jesus takes what Abraham began to do, but did it incompletely. Because if you know the rest of the story, was 10 enough to save the city of Sodom? No. There was a lot more wickedness than Abraham could have fathomed. But what do we have in Jesus as our advocate? He says, Father, you look at the whole world, what's the number he says? If there's only this many righteous, will you spare the world? What's the number Jesus says? Did I hear it? Yeah. 1. There's 1 righteous. Will you spare them? And who's the one? Jesus, who became one of us. You see these echoes and these things, if you see that this is pointing toward the work of Jesus in this beautiful way. So I always wonder, why did Abraham stop at 10? I don't know why he did, but he probably felt like you said, Ruth, surely there's enough. But as we know, man, we are way more wicked than we could possibly fathom. But Jesus knows that, and so Jesus says, no, it's on the righteousness of one, the righteousness of me, that I will do that. So you see these echoes of Jesus in that. Real quick, as we wrap up our time together, to kind of talk through 19 and 20. Chapter 19 is the infamous story of Sodom and Gomorrah, of Lot, and we're not going to read through it. You can read through it on your own, but it is bleak. It is dark. It is not a happy read. There is judgment that befalls that city. It is not good. The prophet Ezekiel, in chapter Ezekiel 16, he talks about it this way. He says, now this was the sin of your sister Sodom. And so it's saying this was the sin. This was the grievous thing that was arising to God, that she and her daughters were arrogant, overfed, and unconcerned. They did not help the poor and needy. They were haughty and did detestable things before me. Therefore, I did away with them, as you have seen. I want you to notice Ezekiel is giving us the indication of like, listen, the thing about Sodom and Gomorrah, which if you know the story, we focus on the sexual sin in that story. That's what brought the judgment. I want you to notice they were doing a lot of not good things. They were doing that. The detestable things it mentions, sexual perversion, the rape that was happening, that was detestable. But notice, it goes even far beyond that. It really is painting the picture. This was a city that was in total depravity. Yeah, comprehensive evil. And it was like that was what was happening. And they did not turn from the Lord. And you see connections even in how Lot was hospitable to those two angels. Lot was being like his uncle, Abraham, but even that was not enough. They still rejected it. They still wanted to harm him, harm those men, and all this crazy dysfunction began to happen. And then as you go through chapter 20, basically it's Abraham offering Sarah up again. So just when you think he's learned his lesson to not offer his wife up to somebody else, he does it again. And now we get to the good news in chapter 21. And so we'll look at that next week with the birth of Isaac in chapter 21. But again, remember, as good and as faithful as Abraham was, he's as sinful and flawed as you and I are. All right? Let's go ahead and let's pray as we wrap up. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for our time together. We thank you for your word, as that it not only shows us about Abraham, but it shows us about ourselves, about how we are wired and the things we get into. But more than that, it shows us your faithfulness. It shows us your provision for us and your invitation for us to trust you. We ask that you would be with all of us this day as we go about and serve you in our vocations. And we ask for all of this in the name of your Son and our great advocate, Jesus Christ. And it's his name we pray. Amen.